Sorry, Chrissy, I couldn't resist. Thank you so much for introducing hair metal into this debate, for reasons which will become very clear very soon. Would also just like to take this opportunity to say hello to Captain Andy. You mentioned Captain Andy in your last video. I've watched a number of his videos, never spoken with him or interacted with him, so just thought I'd take this opportunity. Okay, let's get into it. So is conservatism the new punk rock? Or is it the new hair metal? Great dichotomy and dilemma I'm now placed in. I'm going to continue to argue here that the real parallel here is with punk metal, that punk metal has the edge in terms of comparison with conservatism and the new conservatism and the anti-social justice movements and the bleeding into the alt-right, though I will stress that that's a spectrum, and that idea of a spectrum is something I'm going to come back to time and time again during this particular video, this particular response. So on the screen here we have on the left the spiffing Skid Row with, as you say, the follically blessed Sebastian Bach. That video you showed in your opening statement, I'd forgotten just what an unmitigated arse Mr. Bach can be at times. That was just atrocious. So follically blessed he may well be, neuronally challenged he certainly is. On the right hand side we've got the wonderful Poison, and as you know, mid to late 80s there was a whole explosion of these hair metal bands. Even bands, you know, who you mightn't think might have delved into hair metal, certainly did. And this is one band some of you might recognise in their metamorphosised form after they moved from hair metal into a slightly harder edged form of metal. It's an amusing picture, isn't it? For those of you who know the band. So this is me back in the early 90s. I was a massive fan of metal, all breeds of metal, particularly prog metal, so bands like Queensryche and Fate's Warning, Dream Theater of course, and also thrash. Really big fan of thrash metal. You might notice on the headstock of Mr. Hetfield's guitar here we have this Kill Bon Jovi thing. I particularly like this headstock on Hetfield's guitar because it cuts to this idea that thrash was keeping it real. Thrash was straight. Thrash wasn't posy, you know, unlike that hair metal stuff. Not posy at all. Of course, wearing 9 Inch Nails armbands is not posy at all. You're not trying to create any type of image on the thrash side, of course. So, differences between genres and subcultures, and I think this subculture thing is absolutely key. And I'll come back to it. I mentioned it in the last video. It's really what brings this, which really underpins all of this debate, is this idea of transgression. Does that mean that, you know, there isn't a real concern here in terms of the far right? There is. But again, the issue is taking a spectrum of views and compressing them down into a narrow spike, what we call in physics a delta function. So taking something that this is this wide and making it infinitesimally narrow, and then boxing people and say, right, I've labelled you as anti-social justice, I've labelled you as alt-right, therefore that's how you are defined. And that's dangerous. Similarly, if we are labelled as social justice warriors, as we have been, that boxes us off, and it's remarkable. I'll read comments online saying, well, Moriarty said this, Moriarty said that. No, I didn't. No, I don't believe that at all. And it's what's happened is there's been a projection of, well, this person's an SJW, this person is in this category, therefore they must believe all of this. That's dangerous, whether it's, you know, directed at our side or whether it's directed at their side, if we must break it down like that. These guys, which were hair metal to the max, were a band called Stryper, who were conservative Christians. They used to throw Bibles out into the audience. You might remember them. Yes, and you're right, metal often played into those societal norms, particularly in terms of, as you quite correctly pointed out, the role of women, which I'll get back to soon in terms of the sexist element. But does that mean that punk also didn't play into those norms? Well, we can find examples where it most certainly did. And again, it's about stereotyping an entire... We shouldn't stereotype and we shouldn't label an entire genre, because you can find differences of opinion, you can find differences of style, you can find differences of just about everything within any particular genre. Does metal, for example, have its Racist elements, yes. Absolutely, and I think the recent furore about Phil Anselmo really pointed to this in his ridiculous nonsense about white power. Yes, but does that mean all metal is racist? If I'm a fan of a metal band, does that mean that I should be put in that category and labelled as racist? I can see how that would be really irritating. So, similarly with punk. As you can see, this is Laura Jane Grace, she's Against Me singer, who's written a memoir about transitioning while in a successful punk band. So while she was exploring her sexuality before transitioning, punk was supposed to be so open and accepting, but when it came down to it, it was still hard to be queer in any way and not face judgment for it. Is punk a little bit more opening and welcoming to minorities? Maybe. I'd like to see some type of quantitative evidence that it's much better than metal, for example. And you mentioned this punk versus pandering, that the hair metal was pandering to a particular audience and that punk was, striving to kick against the pricks, basically. Yeah, kind of. I think there's an awful lot of stories about punk that are heavily glamorized in terms of that anti-establishment bent. I don't know about you as well, though, when you're advertising car insurance and butter, it's a question of your definition of pandering, I guess. Not so edifying to see the man who scripted the lyrics for Anarchy in the UK pandering to that extent. As Hicks said, off the artistic roll call for life. Having said that, good old Henry has a rather different take on it, which is, again, spectrum of opinions. And I think Henry's probably earned the right to comment in this arena. I wonder if it ever occurred to people that the reason the music of these interesting and alternative bands is being recruited for advertisements is because the fans are now the ones calling the shots. In other words, we've arrived. That's an important take in the context of our debate, because it is a question about evolution of societal norms, evolution of cultural and subcultural norms, and just how that happens. And does that really happen by a top-down diktat? Does that really happen by you will do this? When the PMRC started labelling albums, did that make the difference? No. What it did was it took those albums and gave them a cachet and give them a coolness and an edginess that kids wanted to buy those albums. So there is a broader question here in terms of regardless of whether we're going to argue that the trends and the growth in sort of conservative views, anti-social justice views, all the way to the alt-right, regardless of whether that parallels punk or metal, there is a broader question of, well, if that's what's happening and it's something that concerns us, particularly as it moves down the further right end, how do we go about tackling that? And I hope we can pick up on that in terms of open debate, in terms of no platforming, all those types of things. You mentioned Spinal Tap, my favourite movie. Oh Lord, I love Spinal Tap. I must have watched it 500 times. This is Dom Lawson, coming back to your very pertinent, relevant comments about sexism in metal. As you can see, Rock Bottom, Why Mastodon's misogynistic new video misfires. This is from 3 years ago, should point out. You can see what Lawson has got to say. I thought metal music was edging away from a culture of crass sexism, but then I watched Mastodon's new satirical, scare quotes around satirical video. While there are enough genuinely horrifying things happening in the world at the moment, this was 3 years ago, without me getting stressed about a metal band's poor creative decisions and low-rent sense of humour, it does irritate me, because heavy music has spent the last few decades steadily edging away from an overriding culture of crass misogyny and making the whole scene a lot more welcoming and palatable to women in the process. Jeez, I love Mastodon. They're such an intelligent band. Really carefully crafted songs. Superlative drumming. Just really, if you think of innovative, original metal, you think of Mastodon. So I feel Lawson's pain here, because just the very fact that, as I said in the previous thing, it's just so bloody predictable and so tired and so unoriginal. That's irks as well. 20 years ago, women were a tiny minority at metal shows, but things have changed dramatically in recent times, and metal is all the better for it. Absolutely. But again, did that happen by top-down diktat? Or did it happen by a natural evolution? And again, I've got Slide It In on my iPod. I've got Whitesnake's 87 on my iPod. I've got a range of other Whitesnake albums. Does that mean I'm a sexist? Because often this is the flavour of what's happening online, is that if you show some type of preference for some type of music or some type of YouTuber or some type of game even, you're labelled as, fitting in that particular box. And it happens both sides. It happens from both sides. And that's worrying. I'm a big Slayer fan. Slayer are not the most, how can I put it, liberal in terms of their lyrics sometimes. For those of you who got South of Heaven, you know what Silent Scream is about. Some of those lyrics are hardly the most progressive, hardly the most liberal. You said so many great things in your video, Chrissy, but this was just a wonderfully crafted, I think it's the appropriate word, sentence here or phrase. I want to get this on a T-shirt. It's wonderful. You talked about the political views spanning from the actual neo-Nazis to the garden variety shitlord of the Skepto-Kekistani community. Skepto-Kekistani community, bravo, that's really, really neat. I like that, I'll be using that in future. But that's exactly it. You make the point yourself. You make exactly that point yourself, is that it's a spectrum of views. And here's where the parallel with punk comes in, because punk did embrace that spectrum. That entire spectrum from the very heavily far right all the way to we're going to do this to push the boundaries and to piss off the establishment. We're not Nazis. We'd be appalled to think we're Nazis, but we're going to use the Nazi symbology and the symbolism and the swastikas, etc., to kick against the establishment all the way to the very far right. It's exactly what we're seeing online. Conservatism is the new punk rock. It's all about spectrum. This guy, again with the flag that I brought up in the last video, so desperate to belong, so desperate to flag up literally his allegiance that he's draping himself in that flag to go along to a conference about, as I believe, skepticism. That's tragic. But he is not of the same class. If he's doing that to kick against the establishment, to shitpost and all that type of nonsense, that childish nonsense, he is not in the same class as some of the others on this particular slide. Similarly, certain YouTubers who play up all to this Kekistani nonsense, they're a little bit dim, and they're a little bit easily led, and they're a little bit naive, but they're not of the same class as some others on this slide. And we need to make these distinctions. We have to make these, because it's not only doing a disservice to them, it's doing a disservice to us. In terms of, by us, I mean those who are perhaps slightly more left of centre in their political views, slightly more amenable to issues of social justice, diversity, equality, etc. Similarly, this type of really simplistic thinking really strongly works against us when we're trying to counter some of the more extreme views. Because it's so easy, if we set up those bounds, if we set up those blockades, for people to become entrenched. And this book I've come across, I must admit I haven't read it yet, I've ordered it. Autobiography of Recovering Skinhead, which looks absolutely fascinating, and it's about somebody's journey back from the sort of far right. And again, we have to make room for that type of change in views. What somebody posted 3 years ago, or even 3 months ago, might not be a good representation of what their views are now. Yet that's not what happens online. What happens online is a video from 8 years ago or 10 years ago, whatever, is used to characterise somebody right to this day, even though their views might have changed dramatically. Now back to Susie. As the piece of music I recorded faded out, the cover of Dear Prudence last time faded out, I'd included this quote, but I want to come back to it because it's really important in terms of that type of U-turn happening for Susie, for her to realise, oh Christ, what have I been doing here? It's a really interesting interview. So it's from this Untied Undone website. You can see the link down there. What about the accusation of anti-Semitism? This is the interviewer. Come on, there was that original lyric in Love and Avoid, too many Jews for my liking. That was a Severin lyric, which is a fairly weak rebuttal. Yeah, but you sang it. Yeah, I sang it, but I took it as it was meant as skin fillings. Now, in terms of stereotyping, that's not the most credible or compelling of rebuttals either, but obviously a lot of people didn't get it that way, so it was changed. The article continues. Sadly, not in time to prevent the far right from claiming Susie as one of their own. Dismayed by the National Front's attendance at gigs, she resorted to wearing a Star of David t-shirt as a middle finger to the British National Party. We reap what we sow. This was 40 years ago. And it's the same type of thing again. It's the same type of thing we're arguing about now. I am not absolving those very large YouTubers who might well have very young audiences for putting this nonsense out there. But the arguments they're making are we've heard 40 years ago. And we've seen the same effects 40 years ago. As you can see, dismayed by the National Front's attendance at gigs, she resorted to wearing a Star of David t-shirt as her middle finger to the British National Party. It might have been ironic, but for some it wasn't classed as ironic. So the parallels with punk are exceptionally strong. Not for the reasons Paul Joseph Watson thinks, but they are exceptionally strong. The subverters, as it says in this final paragraph, the subvertive symbol might not have been of much concern had it not been for the growing reach of the National Front, which at that time of social crisis, was gaining traction and used punk for youth recruitment. Highlight that. Because you said, Chrissy, it was hardly the norm. It was the norm. It was certainly a big element of the norm. It was everywhere. Just to hammer that message home, that it wasn't some fringe thing. It was happening all the time. This is, as you can see, London Skinheads, photo book by Kim Rennie, and this was a day trip to Southend. Now, it doesn't get much more homely and British than a day trip out to Southend. And you can see, quite clearly what type of symbolism is there and what type of salutes and what type of gestures are being made. This is what it means to be edgy in 2017. And for me, this is why conservatism is the new punk rock. Because to be edgy these days, you have to behave, as I said in the last video, and I'm going to just hammer that home a little bit, like a reactionary pensioner. On the left here we have Alf Garnett. So I think a lot of people in the UK will probably be familiar with Alf Garnett, certainly again of a certain vintage like myself. So Garnett was a comedy character in a BBC series called Till Death Us Do Part. And basically Garnett was described as a bigot, and each week he'd rant about certain aspects of British society. Here's a typical rant from Garnett. We got enough bloody foreigners here as it is. Bloody country swarming with ities and krauts and froggies and spaniolis and Brussels sprouts, all coming over here and taking our jobs off of us, aren't they? And I was absolutely delighted to find that when I did a search, there is an Alf Garnett tribute Twitter feed, and indeed he's commenting quite regularly, including today, on Trump's latest nonsense. And of course the first word that Garnett uses, as he would if that series was going today, is libtard. Of course he would. That's perfect. That fits within his persona absolutely completely. So to be cool, to be edgy, be an Alf Garnett. That's the way to go. Conservatism is indeed the new punk rock. Garnett, Yiannopoulos, just the sheer tediousness of this, the sheer cloying need to generate outrage. What else does Yiannopoulos have going for him? Does he write in an original way? No. Does he make original observations? No. Does he rehearse and repeat the same type of tired old talking points time and time again? Yes. Does he do it in an entertaining way? Yes, we've got to give him that. He certainly does. Does he do it for some? Does he do it in a particularly interesting, innovative, original? No. It's the same old nonsense from 40 years ago. Desperately trying to see that outrage. And just for that final punk parallel, and the context of the Emperor's New Clothes and how this is all just so incredibly unoriginal and incredibly tedious because it's all been done before. Mr. Lyne, the final words at the end of the final Sex Pistols gig. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Thanks, Chrissy. Look forward to your video. Really looking forward to seeing that. Thanks for listening to me waffle on, and see you next time.